My name is R. Crosby Lyles, and this is News from the Can. If I do my job correctly, no one is going to be completely satisfied with my reports. Interestingly, though, the utility of my material to a range of narrative warfare operators seems to affect the performance of my YouTube channel and whether or not I get paid. This leads me to think that my life might be easier if I could discover the alchemy behind solid social media feedback and remunerations. But to do that, I would have to be a different person. I would need to give a damn about cultural dynamics, the seemingly random positive or negative associations people make to words, the changing landscape of personal tastes, and validating the worldview of the masses. You know, the bread and butter of YouTube. The primal machinery for survival provides ample wiring to almost everyone for that kind of deception. That is, until someone has had a spiritual awakening to our inevitable connectedness and the cruciality of the good health of the whole to the sum of its parts. Then honest, open-minded, truthful communication becomes a matter of life and death. Anyone who has been seriously ill to war or to prison knows that life and death situations extrude rigorous honesty from us whether we are willing or not. When your physical ass is on the line, no one has time to f*** around with petty illusions about life. Having explored the medium for several years now, I have discovered that a great deal of so-called news discussed on social media is of little consequence to our actual collective survival. Material relating to the real, actual, no-bullshit, most meaningful challenges to our planet get buried with a quickness that prevents close inspection of any kind. Unless, of course, it is being rigorously laid out by someone like John Oliver, the most informed comedian alive. That's because most real issues seem to require a dose of comedy to keep the viewer from going into convulsions of dread. In fact, you may find yourself feeling a little guilty or strange about talking about issues that are indeed hanging over your head like a hatchet from a worn thread. As an experiment, verbalize the acronym CRISPR and see how you feel. CRISPR. Repeat it a few times and see if you feel funny. CRISPR. Maybe a little guilty. CRISPR. Or even a little dizzy. CRISPR. Or slightly nauseous. CRISPR, CRISPR, CRISPR. By the way, putting this acronym in my video almost guarantees low view numbers, which is good because then they don't have to kill me to keep me quiet. They just momentarily squelch your consciousness and pop the entire conversation out of the queue. And hey, maybe a moderately educated postdoc with a gene editing lab in his or her garage isn't really capable of unleashing an organism capable of killing every living thing on planet Earth after all. Sounds like a stretch anyway, right? Besides, we need genetic modification to stave off starvation from poor food production associated with global warming, or the next ice age anyway, right? About that, notice that whether it's global warming or an ice age of some dimension triggered by a grand solar minimum, the effect is the same: food shortage. For decades, Americans paid less money as a percentage of their income for food than any other people on the planet. Granted, for most of that time, our food was overprocessed dog shit in comparison to what average folks eat anywhere in Europe. Nevertheless, now we are psychologically primed to pay more for the same crap we've been eating for decades. The same is true for the trade war with China, priming you to pay more for pool supplies like water wings or splash noodles. And don't forget how the threat of actual war in the Middle East primes you to pay more for gasoline to put in your car. It's a racket. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a climate denier. Climate change from CO2 is an actual no-bullshit real thing, with the prominent feature of polar amplification predicted decades ago by actual no-bullshit real NASA scientists. Here's the thing. Climate doom is being pushed to the forefront of the conversation by most of the big media players. A big part of the narrative, doomsday warming, states that we are all going to fry. The logical fallacy most average folks fall into is that climate change will fry the equator first or more so than elsewhere because of the constant high angle of incidence the sun's rays have on the Earth there. This is not true. I produced a video last year that is a compilation of snapshots of the anomalous temperature measured around the world taken every day for the last 40 years since 1979. You can do this yourself by visiting the Daily Reanalysis tab at climatereanalyzer.org, a product of the University of Maine Climate Research Department. I found that anomalously high and low temperatures largely come as we move closer to the polar regions during the respective polar winter months, and temperature around the equator is nominal around the globe most of the time, with Southeast Asia being the most stable. that, of course, because of the absence of Coriolis force, it is almost impossible for the equator regions to ever see a cyclone. An interesting footnote is that temperature right around the North Pole has been nominal during the month of July every year, year after year since 1979. Lastly, anomalous heat and cold move together in waves, meaning that climate change is not about stable heat like the Earth being thrown into a giant oven. It's a mixture of rapidly moving anomalous extreme heat and cold. Crucially, it's climate chaos. After all, disorder is the end result of raising the heat and thus the entropy of the system. So climate chaos, like sea level rise, is largely a regional problem, and probably a bigger problem for people living above the 40th parallel. Living in Canada or Siberia may really start to suck after a while. The hope of some environmentalists out there is that the doomsday warming narrative might facilitate the fall of the multinational corporate agro-petroleum hegemony that has held sway in Western democracies for over a century. The movement basically boils down to eco-activists being used as pawns by Vladimir Putin in a vain effort to maintain his geopolitical relevance. In light of events related to the 2016 U.S. presidential election, however, proximity to Putin is probably not helpful to anyone's cause. Having said that, and knowing that the temperature is the most stable and nominal around the equator as opposed to the American or European heartlands, the motivation of the real hardcore eco-activists is certainly the preservation of biodiversity around the soon-to-be more vigorously exploited equator. Because the problem experienced by many farmers above the 30th parallel is that they simply can't produce in such a chaotic climate. Dole is closing canneries in the American heartland because of low crop yields this year. Doomsday warming might have some of us thinking that the agro-business would be moving away from the equator, when in fact temperatures there may actually moderate some. Side note, baseline temperature above the oceans appears to be going up according to anomalous temperature data found at climatereanalyzer.org. Clearly, vigorous debate continues about what the baseline temperature of our climate actually is. Unfortunately, I don't see much discussion about CO2 as a cloud droplet aggregator and associated feedbacks from the increased albedo effect from the subsequent formation of more clouds, or the transport of heat from endothermic evaporation at the surface and exothermic condensation higher up in the atmosphere. I say this because some anomalously higher temperature data correlates to precipitation. Furthermore, sea level rise would be a more compelling indicator of the deleterious effects of global warming if it wasn't balanced by news of extreme cold and snow in the places that excess water is supposedly coming from. Obvious effect is obscured by the particulars related to a cause that somehow remains in the abstract. We all know that climate change is part of a complicated narrative war going on between the highest stakes players on the planet. And that simple truth is what prevents us from reaching a solid consensus. In closing, I just visited Costa Rica this past July, 600 miles from the equator, and the weather was beautiful. It was like a fall day in Florida just about everywhere we went. They grow everything in Costa Rica, from rice apples, pineapples, coconuts, and palm oil to citrus. Okay, we got papaya, pineapple, coconut, yogurt, raisins, almonds, and yogurt for the cereal. Coffee with no sweetener in it. And that's beet juice. Perfect. We're going to be so healthy, we're going to want to die. The people are educated nice, and the entire country is eco-conscious to the extreme. And the same is true in many places throughout Central and South America. The people who are going to get hammered by climate change the hardest are probably farmers living above the 40th parallel. Ultimately, though, my trip to this wonderful country in Central America helped me solve a riddle I've been fascinated by for years. Why did Guy McPherson, the father of doomsday warming, move his happy ass from Arizona to Belize? Why? Because the weather is lovely down there. And that's about it for today. I love you guys. Thanks for all your support. Remember to stay provisioned and pay attention to the weather wherever you are. As of this date, Hurricane Dorian is expected to make landfall around 8 p.m. Sunday night. No, landfall time has moved back since last night when this was recorded. Fast-changing data means pay attention. The storm may actually swerve off. Oh, but pay attention. On the east coast of Florida, somewhere near Mar-a-Lago, as a possible Category 4 hurricane. If you live by the coast and they tell you to leave, it's probably a good idea to leave. The strongest winds are on the northeast quadrant of the storm. So just be safe out there. My name is R. Crosby Lyles, and this has been News from the Can. If you like this content, feel free to drop us a like and subscribe. And thanks for watching. See you. News from the